Hi, and welcome to Chatting the Pictures. My name is Cara Finnegan, and I'm a writer, teacher, and historian of photography.
And I'm Michael Shaw, the publisher of Reading the Pictures.
So we're back this week with 3 news photos. As usual, there were jillions and jillions to choose from, Michael.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. This time of year, in normal times, we'd be talking about pictures of the year because there'd be no news happening. And so right now we're kind of mixing, kind of doing a lot of both.
Yeah, every day is pictures of the year, right? That's kind of how I feel. So how about we just dive in? For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we divide the webcast into 3 segments, the first of which we call the news. And that is a news photo of the week. We ask here the question of how do news photos tell a story? And this week's news photo is a very dramatic illustration of the storytelling capacity of news photos, I think.
Absolutely. The photo was taken by Stephane Mahe from Reuters, and literally, pardon my French, the caption reads, "A view of the Place de la République as protesters wearing yellow vests gathered during a national day of protest by the Yellow Vest movement in Paris, France." And before we dive into this, just a couple of quick things. If people haven't been following the Yellow Vest movement in France, this economic uprising, people are wearing these yellow vests. Since 2008, all motorists have been required to have these vests in their car, and the whole economic disparity uprising started over issues with carbon tax and expense to drivers in rural areas. And then the Place de la République is named after the French Republic, and the statue is the personification of France, the figure of Marianne.
Yeah, and she is surely the personification of this photo, isn't she? I mean, this angle. I'm imagining the photographer dramatically hanging out of a window to make this shot in an attempt to really show the size of the crowd. But what that also does is it puts you at eye level with the Marianne, and then, of course, you have to wonder what's going on at the base of that really iconic statue, that symbol of France. And not just a symbol of France, but really a symbol of French citizenship and freedom. So she's holding an olive branch, which you can actually see pretty clearly, despite the dark tones of the photo. What you can't see as clearly is that the Marianne statue also is holding essentially holding like a book, kind of like the Statue of Liberty also is holding a book. And this is the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which of course is the great citizenship statement of France. And then down below, there are apparently at the base of the Marianne statue, there are 3 other statues or reliefs that represent liberty, equality, and fraternity, which are the 3 kind of pillars of French citizenship. So, oh my gosh, so much symbolism, right?
It's
so
loaded.
If you kind of start with that, then the question is, what is going on at the base of Marianne? And so, to me, what I really think is fascinating is the smoke around that base of that statue is kind of is this the haziness of liberty, equality, fraternity, right? Is there something about French citizenship that's being threatened or obscured? And then surely, the prompt of the protest would suggest that yes, that there are people who feel as though the values espoused by this place and by these particular symbols themselves are threatened.
Going up in flames. Yeah. I think there's a lot of subtle messaging in this photo. And the first question I had, I've been following the imagery from this uprising very closely actually in the last week, and I was wondering, why did this picture, among many others, and especially like more violent images around the Arc de Triomphe, why did this picture get so widely circulated this week? And I was thinking, besides the fact it's kind of a bigger view, what it does is it really, to me, shows how orderly these protests have been. At the same time, they've been very incendiary. So, and then you also see when you actually see whatever is happening like this, it's very incendiary at the base, and of course symbolically loaded. But at the same time, that also has a little bit of a kind of festive kind of feeling to it. Again, it's also very contained and orderly. So are we looking at France on fire and their values on fire, or are we looking at, in some respects, also a kind of sense of ignition, where there's this maybe this is also a very glorious populist image?
That's really interesting. And I was thinking too, as you were talking about, what are the different ways to interpret what's happening there? If you didn't know what the context was, you might also think, oh, it's some sort of laser light show, or is that dry ice? Is there some kind of performance
like a festival
happening? And to me, just visually, that notion of ignition is kind of interesting, because one of the things that I was thinking about was there's the whatever the flames, the light, the smoke, the conflagration at the base of the Marianne, but then the people scattered in the crowd were with the yellow vests, and notice not everyone is in a yellow vest, right? It sort of suggests maybe that notion of ignition that you were talking about, that idea that there are these little yellow flames kind of popping up around, in the crowd at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
And then just the visual contrast, of course, to the very moody sky, I think, right, plays into that sense of, it's a really beautiful color palette in this photo. If you like a moody sky, and I do love a moody sky, it's beautiful in addition to being very kind of ominous.
And I think that what's happening there, of course, people there's been injuries and some deaths, but I think you can make an argument that what's happening there is actually very beautiful to some extent. So, and I like your idea too about the sprinkling, where you have, it's not just about these yellow vests or a faction, because it hasn't been a faction, but it's really that they are sprinkled, or they represent the whole. And I think that's really, the photo does that also. So
yeah. Shall we move on?
Yep.
Okay, so our next category is something that we call the look. And here we're interested in looking at the way that news photos push the visual boundaries to illuminate a story or an idea in a particularly aesthetic or interesting way. And here is this week's choice.
And I think we go from French to Greek here. The photo is by Akis Konstantinidis for Reuters. And the caption is really key here. So, we'll probably discuss that in a minute. But the caption reads, "Migrants from Honduras walk towards U.S. Customs and Border Protection officials," in parentheses, not pictured, "in San Diego County, after crossing illegally from Mexico to the U.S. by jumping a border fence. Photographed through the border wall in Tijuana, Mexico, December 2nd, 2018.
Wow, I spent a lot of time with this photo. It is so visually rich, and it's such a great example of how the aesthetic components of a photo can really enrich the idea of the news story. Because surely this is a topic that has been very much in the news. You just hosted a really wonderful Reading the Pictures Salon last week that talked to a number of photographers who are doing great work on the border and explored that issue. So it's certainly really timely. But to me, what makes this photo a compelling news photo is just the visual dynamic. I don't even know where to begin. I guess the first thing would be, I guess, to notice that they've the people in this photo have just crossed the border, scaled the wall, and you'll notice their shadows are behind them. So are they walking into the sunset? Are they walking into the light? That contrast of the blue sky with the very, very dark, shadowy right side of the image. One reading of this photo, which I think would be a little too rosy, is, oh, look, they're walking to freedom. I think the picture is a little bit, isn't inviting us in that direction so much. But to me, that is really interesting, is that like the golden light and the people's backs to us as they're moving onto this new phase. But as you point out, as the caption points out, toward border officials, right? So they're not walking off into the sunset. They're probably walking off to be put into the back of a van, right?
If there's one takeaway people get from us reading us and also looking at this particular picture, is just how much more news photography is doing these days in terms of both storytelling and also moving into the cinematic realm. And this, with the caption, it's like a little movie. It's with drama and beauty, and it's got a very tight plot. So I think it's just extraordinary what these pictures do, and just by adding, the way they wrote the caption, it's really powerful. But
yeah,
at the same time, it's also really powerful as a documentary image. So it's like multi-purpose, because in one narrative or one scene or one, I guess we call it a scene, it refutes the White House narrative. Like in one shot, people are not seeking to enter illegally and escape detection. What we're seeing are people frustrated by the asylum system or the asylum process, it having been subverted by the government, and they're seeking an agent to access the system.
Yeah, they're openly, yeah, right. They're like literally in the light. And again, the presence of the child, right, just plays against that narrative of who is coming across the border that we've surely, heard circulated by our president and many others. I'm really struck by a couple of things about the content of this image, and I'm glad you pointed out just the visual detail here. The first is I'm really struck by, we have the backs of what I presume are the three adults that we can see. And then the child is looking back. And for some reason, I find that a really interesting and almost poignant detail. One wonders what's left behind back there. Are there people border they left behind? Is there somebody that child loves and she's been sent ahead? I mean, you just don't know. And that raised that sense of uncertainty, I think, is very much a part of the story. And then just the visual material in the foreground too, what looks like an abandoned hat and stuff, right? The things people are carrying. It also gives you this sense of what people are abandoning or leaving behind to make this choice, right? As you said, a very political choice to essentially take their chances in a different kind of system. I like two little elements. One, the hat, whether it's theirs or not, and it probably isn't. Still, when you get the movie effect, it feels like the hat says, that you're moving at high speed. It's, you lost the hat. It's all happening in haste. And then the fact that they're ascending too. I think in some way it reminds me of that first photograph too, because it really is trying to get to a higher ground or to a higher place with these issues and these social disruptions, and that heartens me because I think that's human nature. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't noticed that sense that they're walking up, but you're right. And in keeping with, I want to talk a little bit about the right side of the image because you get both the evidence. I mean, I wrote down in my notes golden hour, right? Which is like when people make films, they want to shoot at the golden hour because, the sunset or the sunrise, you don't want the sun to be too bright. Everything needs to be beautiful. And this is a golden hour shot, clearly. But what's also interesting is that where you see the golden hour, the right side of the image, the wall itself is really reflecting that, that golden hour sun. And we, the viewer, are in the wall, like we are the wall. And I think that's really interesting as well, because the other thing this does is that, on the one hand, you've got the photographer who is with those folks who are crossing. And so there's definitely a sense of maybe connection or identification with them. But we, the viewer, are also kind of stuck back at the wall. And, if you want to get philosophical about it, that might be understood to be a kind of commentary on, what's the status of public discourse. Certain people are really obsessed with the wall, the wall as a place, as a space. And this picture is inviting us to like leave the wall behind, get away from the wall, like move on, literally.
Get off the wall.
Yeah, right. Leave it behind. So, that's really, like I said, I get so excited when I can just hang out in a single image for hours and hours.
That's pretty incredible.
So this brings us to our last photo, which we like to call the pick. And this is our stab at thinking about how editors choose particular kinds of images, or why certain news images seem to get more visual traction and circulation than others. And the image we selected, we're actually not going to show you first. We're going to show you an example of a lot of images we saw from a pretty interesting event that happened this week. Michael, do you want to kind of set this up for us?
Well, very simply, most people who follow politics, are all over this, but it was a meeting in the White House between Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, the president, and a zombie. No, I'm sorry, and the vice president.
I also heard that some people were referring to him as the elf on the shelf, which I also enjoyed.
Yeah, it was very interesting. He is holding the line with the red tie while everyone's going blue. But and then the president had let the cameras roll for a little bit and let the reporters ask a few questions, and then he just kept at it. And so what turned into a kind of a free-for-all conversation about the border and Trump then throwing down the gauntlet that he'll close down the government. And it was just an extraordinary moment for real life negotiations where perhaps Trump, after his midterm loss, and then all of these legal setbacks, didn't come out that well. So there was a lot of imagery, and this scene was this angle was probably the more typical one.
Yeah, where you got kind of a sense of everybody all arrayed in the Oval Office, and the media are there. And then here's the photo that we decided to talk about because it's a very different photo from the other ones you saw, like the example we just showed you.
Yeah, this was taken by Michael Reynolds for Bloomberg, distributed by Getty. And it was chosen out by the New Yorker, and they're great photo editors there. They just find a different image, or literally in this case a different angle. There's so much to say about this picture. I think, for me, above all, it just it does show the impact and the real power shift since the midterm elections, and the fact that we're aligned with Nancy. It's like we have her back, and then it's the rare and extraordinary recognition of respect for a female leader. You just especially from Trump, it's hard to find a photo where he's either not talking or else paying real attention to anyone, and Nancy is holding the floor.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because you're right. When I first saw this, and I had not seen it until it was selected for this edit, which itself, as I said, is interesting, right? Because it does point to the fact that I saw lots of versions of the other photo that we saw that showed the whole group. And my first thought was, wow, I didn't think Trump looked at her during that whole thing. I didn't see any other photos where he was looking at her. He's always sort of appealing to the media or to the other people in the room. And so you're right, there is this juxtaposition, and that triangular feature, again, where we have her back and we're with her, we're on her side. And if you think, broadly about politics, right, the House of Representatives is supposed to be the body that does represent the people. It is supposed to be more of the popular side of things, whereas the Senate is this very elite, always more white, more male place, although, that may change eventually as well. But so, yeah, she is in this interesting position. The other part I love about the photo that lines up really nicely with your read, Michael, is the microphone pointed at Pelosi, kind of right above Schumer's head. And so there's literally a microphone being pointed at her, as if to say, okay, we're listening to you now, or we're paying attention to you. And that to me is striking.
That is really interesting.
And so the cameras, the cameras are there, right?
Yeah, she has the floor. And the other thing is, find me a photograph where Trump isn't the central figure, where he isn't the central focus of the image. This is just so extraordinary. First of all, like all the pictures, most of the pictures of him in important meetings they're just irreverent anyway, whether the situation is irreverent or the photographers choose to represent it somewhat that way, or a combination of the two. But this reminded me of, if you look at a lot of pictures from the Obama administration, the way Pete Souza shot Obama, you'd see picture after picture after picture with this setup, where you'd see the back of Obama, where he was like this grounding force and the fulcrum of the action. And to see a picture like that, where Trump's not only like literally like more in the margins and of course, attentive, but also like where he's not, where Nancy Pelosi, a woman and the Speaker of the House who's been so disparaged, is the grounding force in the photo with that same kind of gravitas. It says something's happening.
Yeah. And I think Schumer's facial expression plays on that too, because you get, Trump is kind of blandly listening, and you can sort of see he has to, for this 2-second time, listen to her. But Schumer is listening, and you can tell Schumer's listening strategically. And he's got this face where he's kind of like, I see what she's doing, which I think is really, interesting as well. That it's not just active listening, but you can tell Schumer knows what she's doing, and Trump has no clue, as well. So another week, another set of photos.
Another week, and I think that we'll just have more. Things seem to be slowing down somewhat, but anyway. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. We're very active now in all three spaces. Our border wall salon that Cara mentioned, the replay will be posted and will be announced on all those different social media sites sometime end of the week, first beginning of next, and then be with us again next week. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks much, everybody. We'll see you soon.